The Chofetz Chaim writes, he says, until now, past few chapters, we've spoken about the value of doing chesed, how Hashem responds to us, that even if a person is in a situation where even there's been a decree that he should be compromised in every sense of the word, but if he does chesed, and not does chesed, if he's accustomed to doing chesed, he uses the word ragil, he's accustomed, God will go to bat for that person and annul a decree, and he'll counter all the prosecution against that person. That's the value of chesed. And he spoke about this at length, bringing many sources to this. Now the question is, what about if a person doesn't do chesed? What is the negative side that a person has no interest, he's approached and he turns down the person who's in need of chesed, or he's aware of somebody who's in need of some level of assistance, whether it's a loan, whether it's charity, whatever it is, and he's totally not sensitive to that person. What is the consequence of that person? Or what's the classification of that person? So he cites the Gemara that the Talmud says that a person who's not interested in chesed, he turns a blind eye, he's the equivalent of being a pagan, an idolater. Now, there's a term in Hebrew, I'm sure they don't teach it in the Ulpan or in Berlitz, if you take Hebrew, but it's a word in the Torah, it's called Belial. Belial. Now, in Hebrew, the word old means yoke. Yoke. Beli means without. He's a person lives without a level of responsibility. He doesn't feel responsible to God. Belial. The Torah tells us that if a person borrows money and the sabbatical year comes and the debt is not paid by the end of the sabbatical year, the lender has no right to collect the debt. So very often a person would say, I'm not lending money because I'm putting myself in a compromised position. Because if I lend money, he doesn't pay by the end of the seventh year, the sabbatical year, the loan is canceled, and I have no right to collect it. I mean, there are ways to secure that loan. If you take collateral, you're secured. If you write what we call the crucible, a certain kind of document, the loan is preserved. But if you don't, then you have no right to collect that loan. So the Torah says that if a person goes and says, I'm not lending because of that concern, that the borrower may not pay, and I'll be compromised. So the Torah says that person is Belial. It's like he lives without a yoke, the yoke of God. And it's like he's doing, and where do we find the word Belial? The Torah tells us that if you have a community where the majority of the community goes and does idolatry, it uses the same term, Belial. Why did they do idolatry? Because since they have no sense of God, therefore they did idolatry. That community must be destroyed. It's called Ir Nidachas. So we're saying that this person who turns a blind eye on the poor man, or doesn't want to know about other Jews' financial plight, he's the equivalent of that, Belial. See, explain what's the reason. And the Torah says that if you help the poor and you do the chesed, Hashem says you merit blessing. That's what Torah says explicitly. If you're not concerned that your financial situation will be compromised, and you lend the money because God says, lend it, God says, I'm the guarantor. See, even if the man doesn't pay, ultimately you can be compensated in multiples. So why don't you lend it? If God gives you the guarantee that you'll be compensated in multiples, so why don't you lend it? The answer is because Belial, because you're a person that you're not concerned what God says or what he wants, and you don't have that trust in him that he has that ability, he will do it. So the person is behaving like the pagan. The pagan says, God, I have my own way of seeing it. I pick and choose what I believe. Therefore, that's the classification of the person who doesn't do chesed. Now, it's very interesting. A Jew, the Gemara tells us that if a Jew doesn't have certain innate characteristics, attributes, you question his pedigree. Why? that if a Jew is an original Jew, he descends from Avram Avinu, the founding patriarch of the Jewish people, and the other patriarchs. Part of our genealogy is Rachmanim. Rachmanim, we have mercy, we have compassion, we have conscience, and we do acts of loving kindness. We do it naturally. So the question is, why aren't you sensitive to it? You should come. It should be natural. So the answer is, if the person doesn't come from Jews initially, he comes from converts. Okay, he doesn't have it within his gene pool, but a Jew does, and you do have the sense. So why aren't you responding? The answer is because you're suppressing it. You're suppressing because you have something interfering. What could be the only thing interfering? The person doesn't come to it naturally. He has to somehow, so-called, learn it. But if you're original Jew, why don't you come by it? Why don't you respond naturally? The answer is because you're suppressing it. Why there's interference? Why are you suppressing it? Because I really don't believe God will compensate me. There's a cost factor. If I lend the man money, if I give charity, that means I have less for myself. I want that financial cushion. You got to save for that rainy day. But so Chazal tell us, you save for that rainy day, you're not going to have that financial cushion, and it's going to be a rainy day. You're only encouraging God's response that if you don't believe that he's the benefactor, so to say, that he's the one who actually gives you the blessings will be withdrawn from that person. This is the negative side of not doing chesed. If you have the ability to help and you don't, and we say help doesn't mean, chesed doesn't mean necessarily monetary, in money. Advising a person, encouraging a person, saying a good word to a person. There are many ways that you're able to actually do chesed. Chesed is multi-wronged. There are many levels. Everybody hooks in whatever way he wants to hook in. It's interesting. Take this off the recording. Mark tells over a story, and the Chofetz Chaim cites it. The Talmud tells us that there were three of the wealthiest Jews in Klal Yisrael. They were actually responsible to underwrite the Jewish people. One of them was Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law. His name was Kalba Savua. That's what he was known as, Kalba Savua. Why? In Aramaic, the word Kalba. In Hebrew, the word Kelev is a dog. In Aramaic, Kalba is a dog. We say the Kadgadja, Vosa Kalba, right? Ochel Gadja. The Kalba, the Kelev, or Noshel Leshunra, the dog bit the cat who ate the kid, the goat. So he was called Kalba Savua. In Hebrew, the word Savea means sated. So he was so wealthy and he was such a philanthropist and did such acts of kindness. If you enter his home as hungry as a dog, you would leave sated. So he was known as Kalba Savua because there was nobody who ever left his home who wasn't sated, and all his physical needs were accommodated. That was Kalba. That was Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law. He eloped with his daughter. That was a whole story. But there was another person. His name was Nagdim Ben Gurion. Who was Nagdim Ben Gurion? His name was Ben Gurion, but he was called Nagdimon. In Hebrew, the word to be menaked means to pierce. Pierce. What was the story? The Jewish people. It hadn't rained. There was a drought for endless years, and there was no water. But there was one Roman who had a tremendous reserve of water. And this Jew, this Ben Gurion, had a tremendous amount of money, wealth. And this person had enough pools of water that he'd be able to satisfy the water need of the Jewish people. And he said to him, if I don't repay you with the water by a certain date, I will shift all my money into your account. So this Goy, this pagan Roman, was waiting for that due date that this Ben Gurion shouldn't be able to meet the due date. All of a sudden, what happens? The date comes and nightfall comes. The world is dark. You hear this? He sends a message immediately to this Jew. It's time to shift. You have to pay your financial commitment. You didn't return the water. You should what? You have to relinquish all your wealth to me. We're talking about he was the wealthiest Jew in the Jewish people. Forbes #1. So he praised Hashem, is Nagdim Ben-Gurion, and he turns his eyes heavenward. He says, whatever I did not do for my own glory. I did it purely for your children and for your glory. Because if the Jews wouldn't have had the water, they would have perished. And I'm willing to give it all away, but I did it only for your glory. Perform a miracle. And allow this pagan to understand that day hasn't ended. It was as dark as night. After he finishes praying, what happens? The clouds part and the sun is shining brightly. And all of a sudden it gets overcast and comes down in torrents of rain, and all the water systems are overflowing with water. That's the story with this man. So in Hebrew, the word Nagdim means he pierced the clouds, and Hashem performed a miracle for him that this pagan realized that it wasn't nightfall yet and the debt wasn't due, and then God paid the debt by the water coming down in torrents. That's the story. So therefore, he was called Nagdimon Ben-Gurion. He was the one who pierced the clouds, and who was Ben-Gurion? His name was Ben-Gurion. So the Gemara tells over a story. Reb Shimei Yochai, the author of the Zohar, was traveling with his students, and they see a woman picking barley from the dung of the donkeys of the Arabs. Could you imagine? That means she was so desperate for food, she was picking barley out of the dung. I mean, you have to really be desperate to go to that extent. So he comes over to her, and she immediately lifts her head, stands up erectly, and he says to her, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm the daughter of Nagdim Ben-Gurion. I'm the daughter of that very wealthy man." So he says, "What happened?" He says, "I remember I was at your wedding, and when we wrote the ksuba, your father had given a dowry, 1,000,000 golden coins." You know what 1,000,000 gold coins is? A gold coin is 25 silver coins. So your dowry was 1,000,000 golden coins. I mean, how have you become so impoverished? What happened to your father that you're picking barley from the dung of Arabs? And he's saying this in front of his students. So he says, how far could a Jew fall? It's not only from the dung of the lowly donkey, from the Arabs' donkey, the lowest people, the Arabs. The Jew has to stoop to pick dung from the lowest people, from the animal, of the lowliest animal, from the dung. To that, so he asked why. Because the Gemara tells us a story that besides being philanthropic, Nagdim Ben-Gurion never walked on the ground. Wherever he would walk, there'd be silk carpets. His servants would put silk carpets out in the street, and he'd walk on silk carpets. And after he walked on those carpets, they would roll up the carpets and give it to the poor, besides the money he gave to the poor. So why did he lose his wealth? Giving such charity, being so philanthropic, giving such a levet tzedakah, why did he lose his wealth? So the Gemara answers, the Talmud answers, in Aramaic, lefum gam l'shichna. Each camel according to its load. You load a camel. A person could load up with 100 pounds, 150 pounds. A donkey could load up with 500 pounds. A camel maybe more. But each camel according to its capacity, meaning based on his financial worth. What he gave may have been enormous, but he did not meet his quota. God expected more. If I've given you this kind of wealth, this kind of bracha, you should have been more generous. So that he fell short of what he should have given, God says, you know something? I'm withdrawing it. So the Chofetz Chaim cites this Gemara, and he says, you see, it's not enough just to do chesed. It's not enough just to be sensitive and feel the other person's plight, but based on your financial capacity, you have to respond on that. Like a person goes who's truly needy, and a rich man goes and gives him $100, and the poor man is disappointed. So the rich man says, $100 is a lot of money, which is true. But in terms of what you're able to do for this man, for you, $100 is not a lot of money. And God evaluates it, not on what the recipient's receiving, it's what you could have done for that person. So Nagdim Ben-Gurion, because he could have done more, even though he gave enormous amount of wealth away, But based on what God gave him, God says you didn't give away enough. And because you didn't give away enough, which you should have given away more, because I gave it to you to give away, therefore I'm withdrawing the wealth. I'm withdrawing the blessing. Story I once told that this person from Israel came to raise money to marry off a daughter. And he goes into a person's home. I think the person lived in Brooklyn, observant person. And he writes him a check. Listen to the story. He writes him a check for $100. This man could have written a check easily for $1,000. And he sees that this person from Israel is disappointed. So he says to him, I see you're disappointed. He says, you know why I wrote you a $100 check? Because next year you have another 10 children. You're coming back next year again for another check. So therefore, that's the reason why I only gave you $100. If you only have one child to marry off, I'll maybe give you $1,000. But because you have probably you're coming back next year and the year after for the other children, therefore I'm only giving you $100. So this person says to him, I want to explain to you something. You're telling me the reason why you only give me 100 because next year I'm coming back for another check. He says, first of all, who said you're going to be here a year from now to write the next check? It seems to you dictate your own existence. You're speaking on such a cavalier level. Next year, you're coming back to me again. So he says, who said you're going to be here next year? To have the merit to write me the check. You know something? It's not you, it's Hashem. That's what it's all about. He hit this guy between the eyes. You can't imagine. Immediately, the man wrote him a $5,000 check. Immediately. You know, sometimes you have to rattle a person's cage. People sit in their ivory towers. They have 60 secretaries till you get to them. But if you get to them and you say what you have to say, and the person has merit, that statement is going to resonate and they're going to touch the person. And because he said it to him, the person had the merit to do what he should do. So in many situations, will we justify giving less when we should give more because we have our own way to see it. This is the story. So there's always this question of L'fum Gam L'Shichna. According to it's the camel, it's load. So as I said, Chesed is not only does it play out in dollars. Let's say you hear of a problem and you're able to help the person. You can make a connection. You can introduce him. Or you could advise him. And you don't. You know something, you've fallen short. You've fallen short. You could have done chesed, you could have helped the man, and you didn't help the man. I'll tell you a story. Many years ago, there was a student in Or Sameach, got married, and they couldn't have children. He was married 2-3 years. And what happened was that as a student at Or Sameach, he came from Sydney, Australia. This boy, young man, he was married, and he had Hodgkin's. And when he had Hodgkin's, he was on the chemo, and the chemo affected his sperm count. And because of his sperm count was affected, he wasn't naturally, he couldn't father a child. But there was a certain fertility doctor that, as low as it was, he was able somehow to activate the sperm that a person that he would be able to father a child. So a person comes to me, very special person. He's raising money. It was quite a bit. In vitro wasn't covered originally by insurance. Coming to me, he's trying to raise $25,000 for the fertility doctor, but give him a chance to have a child. So I said to him, I said, you know, money is a very valuable commodity. We don't have that much money to go around. If we could somehow get a fertility doctor, do it gratis, why waste the money? We could use that money for something else. So I said, I think I know somebody who knows, who's a very prominent doctor. It wasn't Alan. And I'll call him, and he'll make a connection to that fertility doctor, and he'll give him the service without cost. Won't charge him. And that's what I did. So all of a sudden, the $25,000 is not needed. So wherever that money is in the Jewish community, when some other need comes up, that money could be shifted into that need. So chesed is not necessarily taking the money out of your pocket. It's coming up with an approach that you're able to address the problem and alleviate the problem, do the chesed. So it doesn't always have to manifest itself in writing the check. But you have to have an interest, and you have to put yourself out. You make a call, sometimes a call is a favor. There's always a cost factor. Some next time you need a favor, you don't want to call on that favor. People make all kinds of calculations. But if you don't look at yourself, you look at the need, that breaks through all that nonsense, and you do what you're supposed to do. That's chesed. So that's what I'm saying. Nagdim Ben Gurion, he was a man, fum gam l'shichno. Based on the camel, it's the load. So if you have the capacity to make connections, you have the capacity to advise many things, and you fall short of it, what happens, God forbid. God pulls the plug, and you no longer have those connections, and you no longer have the capacity. Today we speak about dementia and Alzheimer's. People who are brilliant, very effective people. All of a sudden today, it's a shame. You look at them, it's like something, if you knew the past, it's what they've become. But I'm not saying any claim, because you find the best people suffer from this. But maybe if he would have used his mind and done chesed through advising, helping, suggesting, making connections, God could override any. Well, you say it's part of the gene pool. This family has that. What a gene that Alzheimer's affects them at a younger age. There are always exceptions to the rule. Hashem can always intervene and ward it off that it doesn't happen. I'm not saying that's why you should do it, but if you invest your gift of God, your endowment, to do for Him, then He does for you. That's the way it works. And we spoke about chesed. If you do chesed, especially, it's for 2,000 generations, yourself, your grandchildren, till the end of time. God will pick up the ball and run on your behalf. He'll be there for you, regardless of what the problem is. But you have to be rogel b'chesed. You have to be a person that you're geared. You're wired to chesed. You want to help other people. It's not once in a while you pick up a phone. If you could, I want to be there. I want to be helpful. There's a principle, whatever path you want to walk, God will assist you on that path. If a person wants to do good, God will bring opportunity to you to do good. Person has no interest in doing good. He wants to be a conniver, being dishonest. God will bring not opportunities, situations where you could be dishonest. Even the thief who wants to be the thief, God will present challenges for him to choose to be the dishonest or not be dishonest. It's referred to, so whatever path you choose, God will open those paths for you to make it available. That's the way it is. So I mentioned to you, I was for Shabbos Shuvah, the Shabbos Shuvah, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I was on Fifth Avenue Synagogue. I mentioned it to a number of people. And I was there, and I spoke 5 times. And I had a level of success beyond my expectation. Every time I spoke, it was a grand slam. When I say grand slam, I'm talking over the top, over the fence in Yankee Stadium, polo grounds, wherever you want to call it. That's what it was. So there was a man there, an old man. He approaches me. The man's 86 years old. And he says to me, Rabbi, he says, I like what you said. I want to have a relationship with you. I have a foundation that has millions of dollars. He's 86 years old. I would want to support your organization, whatever it is. As long as you're recognized by the government, I want to support your organization. He says, we should sit and talk. Send me the information, and I want to get involved. I said that never intended. I'm here to people to sensitize them for what it's all about, what the 10 days of Aura about, what Rosh Hashanah's about, Yom Kippur is about. Spoke about many things. Nothing about charity, nothing. This is the story. So far I haven't followed up with him. And this person had just given to the shul $800,000 for the refurbishing of the shul. A 15 Sigma, they did a major renovation. So this is not a person just talks, he does. So now what's going on in Israel, the needs, the Jews down south, they don't have what to eat. They have to be moved out of harm's way. We're talking about mega dollars are needed to provide for thousands of families. They should just have vouchers to have food. Besides, moving him to Yerushalayim, which is a safer location, provide new residences for them, food there, whatever it is. So I called up the person, a certain person. I said, I have to speak to this man. I have to speak to him. Because he said to me, I want to help you. So I don't need money in my pocket. It's not for me. When he says my organization, through Yad Avram, we channel a lot of money to Israel for poor people or needy causes. So I put a call into this person. This person now is down in Florida. He's an older man because the winter is coming. And I said, and I left a message on his phone. This person spoke to him. He says, the rabbi would like to speak to you. He says, let him call me on Monday. I'll speak to him. Okay? Yeah, what's going on over here? If I could pull out of him, I don't want to pull out. He should have the merit to give me $500,000 to provide food for these people who have nothing to eat, literally nothing to eat. You know what I'm doing for him? You know what kind of merit, what kind of mitzvah he's going to be doing? That he's putting his money with special families. God says, you're feeding my children, not just ordinary children. These are people who are committed to my religion, to my Torah. They're raising children the way they should be raised. You know, what kind of privilege this man's going to have? The chesed I'm doing for him. But again, so God allowed me to find favor in this man's eyes. I didn't even speak to him. He came over to me. And he wants the help. All of a sudden now the need has arisen. Now I feel, I could shift this kindness over there. And how many people could benefit from that? We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of families, which include, these families have 8, 10 children. Not only feed them, these families are traumatized because of what's going on over there. Missiles, machine gun fire. They hear it all day long, these kids. They can't deal with it. Chaim cites a midrash, quotes a Gemara also, that if a person approaches you who's needy, very often, if a person truly can't help, you can't help. But very often the person feels he's empowered and the other person's at his mercy. And you have a right to say no. Why? Because I dictate. I dictate. Very often that's the way it is. People behave that because I am who I am and you need me, I will decide whether I give or not give. That's very often the mindset of a person. If a poor man comes to you, say, and he needs, and you should relate to his need, the person says, something, I don't think I'm going to help you. So based on the verse, Hashem says, God says, you realize you are in your position. He's in his position because I put you where you are. I put him where he is. But you realize the roles in life could change immediately, that you could be the needy person and he could become the person who will be the philanthropist. So don't be so high and mighty. Very often it emanates from an arrogance. It's from your ego. You think you are. Hashem could teach you what you're not in a moment. One bad investment. I always tell about the story with the Chafetz Chaim, where the Chafetz Chaim went to a very wealthy Jew. In Europe, whenever there was a fire, because the Jews were confined to like a ghetto type of situation, they weren't permitted to live in other areas. So they literally lived on top of one another. The houses were literally hundreds of years old, made of wood. And if it was a dry season, if there was a fire, in a moment, the whole community could burn down. So there was a community, there was a fire of a few hundred families, and literally they were out, exposed to the elements. Winter was coming, and Chafetz Chaim felt he had to raise money to really get these people, get them a roof over their heads for the winter. So he approaches this very wealthy man who lives in a mansion made of stone, and he could easily make a difference to all these people's lives. And he comes to the person, and he says, the Chafetz Chaim says, you have an opportunity here. And he was an observant man. You have an opportunity here. You can help all these families. He says, I have no interest. He says, why don't you have an interest? He says, look, the money I made is mine, and I have a right to choose where I want to put my money, where I don't want to put my money. I choose not to give. So the Chafetz Chaim says to him, don't you realize the blessing God gave you is only that you should be God's administrator and distribute money. I'm not asking you for all your money, to give a percentage to help these people. He says, I don't believe in that. The money is mine. I have a right to make this, to give it where it was. Where I want to give it, I'm not giving. And the money is all mine to do what I want. Okay? Chavetz Chaim says, but a Jew doesn't speak that way. He says, as God gave it, he could take it. That's how quick you could lose it. He says, I'm so diversified. I have my money in land. I have it in timber. I have it in this. I have it in that. I have it in commodities. If I lose on one, I'm hedged against that. I'm secure. That's what he says to Chavetz Chaim. Chavetz Chaim says, you realize a Jew doesn't speak this way. God could take everything in a moment. I mean, a person, God forbid, could die. The moment he dies, you can be diversified. It doesn't make a difference. What happens? The Russian army in time of the Tsar, the Russians were rabid anti-Semites. And very often, the army would march through villages and towns, and the Jews were petrified. Because if the general who led the cavalry through the community felt the Jews didn't respect him sufficiently, in a moment he could wipe out the community. Okay? There's a general coming through with his troops, and they're coming through this village, and the village, this Jew owns most of the village. And they have to go over a bridge. And as he dismounts the general, and he leads his horse, and he has boots with spurs. As he walks across the bridge, one of the knots in the boards was knocked out, and his spur gets caught in that opening, twists his ankle, and breaks his ankle. Would you imagine? He's livid. He wants to know who owns this bridge, who owns this town, who's responsible, who did not maintain this. They find out it was this Jew. In a moment, he was sent off to Siberia. That was the end of it. You understand? God gives, God takes. In a moment, this person's life came to an end. But if he would have given and exercised and utilized that endowment for what it was meant to be used for, he would have merited protection. This incident only happened to the general because the Jew had to be taught a lesson. But that's life. If we would see God's chesed, you'd be astounded and see how God is involved. I want to share something with you. I spoke to Israel early this morning for davening, and I told you I'm involved there to a degree. And this person says to me, calls me, he's my partner over there. And I had introduced him to a certain person. He did all kinds of videos. His name is Shai Graucher. I don't know if you noticed it. He's doing it for the army. He gave away 1,000 pairs of tefillin. People never wore tefillin, and food, and these packages. It's not to believe what he's doing. Thousands and thousands. He's providing army gear, helmets and vests and this and that. There's nothing. Trucks are being sent to the front continuously. It's raising mega dollars. And I called him because a certain student of mine has given him a lot of money. And I said, I want you to speak to him. He should shift some of the money to what I needed for in Israel. So this person called him, and at first he wasn't moved. So he called me this morning that he had just given him of the money. He gave him $130,000 to give to these families to feed them. Why? Because my student who lives in the Midwest called him up and told him, no ifs or buts. He's giving them all this money. He has to give a percentage of money to this person. Okay. Then he calls a certain person who's very involved in representing one very big philanthropist in the United States, and to find out about this person, how credible he is. Okay. A few years ago, I introduced this person to that person, and he met him. And this person in Israel, he's not an ordinary person. And he called the person in America. He says to this person, I've never met a person as qualified, as capable, and has done as much as this person has done. So this person thought this person in the United States would respond and help him out in other things that he's doing in Israel. Fell on deaf ears. Didn't work. Person wasn't moved by it, didn't give him anything. Okay? This person who gave him the 130,000 calls up this person because he's, it's like you call Dun and Bradstreet. You want to find out a person's rating. He calls up this person who had met him, and he says, I want to tell you something. In my life, I never met a person like this person you're talking about. Never met anybody as qualified, as effective, as responsible. What he's done, very few people have done. Whatever you could do to help him, you help him. Okay? So he calls him up. After he gave him the 130, he says, I want to be your partner. Whatever you need something, just call me. So I said to the person who called me, I said, you see, unbelievable, you see Hashem's chesed. King Solomon says, Shlach lachem chalayayim alamayim. We have to send our bread underwater. Do we know how things are going to return? We have to do the right thing. The response, we have no idea what the response is, but we got to do the right thing. You were disappointed a few years ago that you met this person and it turned out to be nothing. But because you met that person was impressed with you. Today, 3 years later, when the need is overwhelming, now you have a level of credibility that you could have never had. So do we know when you make an investment, you plant ultimately, and you plant with the right intent, you sow. You sow, you reap. And Baruch Hashem, now he's starting to reap. But what's he reaping? He's reaping doing chesed at a level which humanly would be impossible unless he has this credibility to be able to be eligible to receive this kind of money. You see, unbelievably, Hashem behind the scenes, how he orchestrates things, relationships, and when it's ready to sprout, it sprouts. In Shana and Kippur Davening, we say, in the liturgy, we say, Mamlich Molochim v'lo Hamlucha. God coordinates kings, but he's the king. He's the coordinator. But ultimately, he's the one who puts you there and he takes you out of there. God forbid. So what do we have to do? We have to do what he wants us to do the right thing. What the outcome is going to be, we have no idea, but we have to do the right thing. That's the rule of thumb. That's the perspective of a Jew. But I don't see it. You don't have to see it. I read an article, it was in this week's Mishpacha, written, the man is a very advanced intellectual. He wrote this article, phenomenal article. We see things today, unfortunately, the tragedy that took place, the terrorists, when they came into that festival, and the way they slaughtered people and what they did to them, a level of inhumanity, it's not to be believed. We can't, thank God, we can't even relate to it. They're like sub-barbarians, the worst of barbarians, these people. And how do we understand it? 1,400 people have been killed so far. The numbers are staggering. It's like Holocaust numbers. This kind of atrocity has been done since the Holocaust. And Hashem is allowing it. So he says something interesting. We as Jews, you have the foot soldier going out to battle. Does he understand the strategy of the battle? He doesn't set the game plan. The generals, they understand the total picture, and based on what they have to accomplish is a strategy. So the foot soldier goes out, and he's trained to do what he's supposed to do. He doesn't try to figure out what the strategy is. And you focus, and you're not distracted anything but doing what you're supposed to do. So he says, who's the general? Hashem's the general. He set the strategy. We don't understand. But we can't get distracted with what we don't understand. We can't get distracted with that. As the foot soldier, can't get distracted to figure out what the strategy is. Because that's not for him to understand. And he knows it's not for him to understand. But he knows he has to do his responsibility as the foot soldier. Identically, Hashem is the general. He has the plan of action. We're only there to implement what each of us on an individual level has to be involved in. What do we have to be involved in? As a Jew, whether it's giving charity, tzedakah, whether it's studying more, doing mitzvahs better, being more united, each Jew with his fellow Jew. That's what we have to do. That's the foot soldiers. But what about? You don't ask the question, what about? That's not a question for us to ask. As we don't question the hierarchy, but we do what we're supposed to do identically, we don't question Hashem because what he's doing, he knows what he's doing. And he wants us to respond as soldiers. And we are his soldiers. And he gave us the means, he gave us the weaponry. The weaponry is called Torah mitzvahs, or the financial means to support what we have to support. That's the article. Phenomenal article. It was like 2 pages, but the message and the way it was written was phenomenal. Good memory. And I remember most things. Alan shared with me that when he was sitting shiva for his father was a Holocaust survivor. He was in the concentration camp. And he heard stories from people who came to pay the shiva visit that he never knew. How his father, when he was in the concentration camp, how he went and saved lives. Alan, remember you told the stories?
Yeah, Mr. Schwimmer, I remember him very well.
Alan was like amazed. His father never shared these stories with him. So there's certain, like you're saying, your parents did chesed. And because that is your orientation, so you can appreciate and you have a sensitivity, as your parents mentored you to have that sensitivity, you have that sensitivity. With God's help, your children being exposed to your behavior, they also will have the sensitivity. You know, Alan, I want to just speak about Alan. Even though it says this week's parsha, we read that when you say a person's praises, you only say part of it, not his full. Alan, as a doctor, very often people say to him, Dr. Spiegel, I want to give money to charity. Where should I give it? And he advises him where to give the money, if it's tzedakah. Alan says, I think, something, you don't put on tefillin. Maybe you should put on tefillin. This is a doctor advising a patient after he has a recovery to put on a pair of tefillin. He's not a spiritual doctor. You want the answer is every Jew has the ability to be a spiritual doctor. That if you have, and that's chesed, by advising that person, especially if he embraces it, you've given him an opportunity which is one of a kind in a lifetime. That's what you've done for him. It's more than giving him the piece of bread. So all of us have moments where we're able to suggest something and it'll make a difference in that person's life. And that's what we have to do. So it's not only this or that. Just tell you a story. It happens multiple times with me. Multiple. I have a brother-in-law. He has a kollel in Cincinnati for many years. An outreach kollel. And every year, I haven't done it in years, he would bring a group of the people who would come to the kollel to study once a week, twice a week. And they were professionals, lawyer, partner, law firm, whatever it was. And he brings this group. And it was about 6, 7 people. And he gave them a tour. He took them to Lakewood to meet the Rosh Hashivas in Lakewood, to Chaim Berlin. And one of the stopovers was by me. They would come for shachris, eat breakfast, yad of rum. And then I would speak to all 6 of them. Then I'd speak to them individually. Harvey, Daf Yomi is 11 o'clock.
I thought it was at 10.
No, 11.
Okay.
You're welcome to hear the story.
Okay, I'd like to, if that's okay.
Okay. It's story time. So, yeah. Larry, you there? Larry's off. So then I meet with one person and I say to him, do you put on tefillin every day? He says, whenever I go to the kollel, I put on tefillin. That's what I put on tefillin. I said, why don't you put on tefillin every day? He said, I don't know the pair of tefillin. So the only time I have tefillin available is when I go to the kollel. So I said to him, could you afford to buy a pair of tefillin? He said, well, of course I afford it. But the rabbi never told me to buy a pair of tefillin. I said, I'm telling you to buy a pair of tefillin. I'll speak to the rabbi. He'll get you a pair of tefillin. So he's putting on tefillin every day of the week because of this conversation. Well, I'm not finished. Then I notice that his sideburns are cut high on his head. A Jew is not supposed to cut his sideburns. So you have to leave your sideburns grow to a certain point. So I say to him, I said, I want to ask you a question. do you use an electric shaver or do you use a straight blade when you shave? He says, I use a straight blade. He says, is it a problem? I said, the Torah says every time you use a straight blade, you're in violation of 5 negative commandments. Plus, you cut for the sideburns. I said, do you have a problem buying an electric shaver? He says, no. If that's what I'm supposed to, I'll buy an electric shaver. See, that conversation, he wears tefillin every day. Since then, the story goes back 15 years ago. He hasn't used a razor. And okay, so you see what it takes. Okay, fast forward, I meet him a few years ago. He's at a wedding. He meets my wife. His wife had a PhD in psychology. And in Cincinnati, his wife started a new school, a religious school. From that tefillin and that conversation with the electric shaver, they became fully observant. And he says to my wife, he says, your husband launched me. That he said to me there's a school they built, and he's a partner in his father's law firm, and he's a philanthropist, all came from the tefillin and not shaving with a razor. You understand? In Israel, Alan knows I was involved in Ezra Mitzvah, it's a certain organization where they provide medical equipment and medical services to people free. So I was staying in a certain hotel in Yerushalayim, and one of the people there asked me, would I meet a person who's visiting from Ottawa, a very wealthy person who supports this organization? And what's the story? He's there, his son is going to be bar mitzvah, and his son has a degenerative disease, and soon after the bar mitzvah, his son's going to pass away. You hear the story? So they brought him to Israel, they give him this experience, but in a few months, he's not going to be alive any longer. Okay? And he was staying in the David Citadel. It's a nice hotel, 5-star hotel. So he asked me, could I meet him in the lobby? I said, of course I'll meet him in the lobby. And so I meet him there with this other person from this organization. Begin the conversation, I'm involved, this and that. And I notice his sideburns are cut high. Same story. And he tells me about why he's there. His son is going to pass away, and I feel his pain. So I say to him, do you use a straight blade, a razor? He says, yeah. I said, why? He says, because the Chabad rabbi who I go to in Ottawa never told me I shouldn't use a straight blade. Never brought up the subject. So I tell him, I said, you have a problem using a shaver? Electric shaver? No. He says, from now on, I'm committed only electric shaver. I said, maybe in the merit of that, God will give extra months to your son. You never know. Nothing's beyond God's ability. He said, just a few words. You never know what a few words could change a person's life, or what it could bring about. There's the ripple effect. You throw a stone in the water, the ripple effect. So we do chesed. Chesed has to be money. Chesed has to be advise you in business. What about if I advise you and I touch you, that I give you a piece of eternity? What's the value of that chesed? It's not to be computed. But one of us is in a position, we have friends, relationships, and the person with value, because of the relationship, you can make a difference in that person's life.